The rain fell in sheets that November afternoon, turning the sidewalks of Pike Place Market into mirrors that reflected a Seattle she no longer recognized. Eleanor Hartwell stood beneath the green awning of a flower stall, watching the world move past her as if she were a ghost. She was 63 years old, and she had become invisible, not metaphorically. Not in the way women her age often spoke about feeling overlooked in restaurants or passed over in conversations. Eleanor had actually watched a young couple walk through the space where she stood just moments before, their bodies moving through hers like smoke through air, their laughter untouched by her presence. Her hands trembled as she reached for the wooden post of the awning. Her fingers passed through it. The sensation was neither cold nor warm. It was absence itself. The feeling of reaching for something solid and finding only the memory of substance. The flower vendor, a woman perhaps 40, with calloused hands and kind eyes, continued arranging chrysanthemums as if Eleanor weren't there. Because she wasn't. Not anymore. Eleanor's breath came shallow and quick. Her heart. Could a heart still beat if the body holding it had ceased to exist? Hammered against ribs she could no longer feel. She looked down at herself. She could see her hands, her wool coat the color of autumn leaves, her sensible brown shoes darkened by rain. But when she tried to touch her own arm, there was nothing. Just the suggestion of form, like watercolor on wet paper. The market churned with life around her. Fishmongers called out their catches. Tourists photographed the famous flying fish. An old musician played Dylan on a battered guitar, his case open for coins that people dropped without looking. Small acts of communion with a world Eleanor could no longer touch. How long had she been fading? Days. Weeks. When had the world stopped seeing her? And why could she still see it? This is the story of Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who spent 40 years being exactly what everyone expected her to be, until the day she discovered what it meant to truly disappear. Seattle in 1979 was a city caught between identities. The counterculture of the 60s had left its mark, but the tech revolution that would define it hadn't yet arrived. It was a working city, a rain-soaked city, a city where people like Eleanor lived quiet lives in modest houses with rhododendron bushes in the front yard and 30 years of memories pressed between the walls. Eleanor had been a librarian, a mother, a wife. She had raised 2 children who now lived on opposite coasts. She had buried a husband 3 years prior. She had done everything right, everything expected, and somewhere in the process of being useful to everyone else, she had misplaced herself. What happened to her that November would challenge everything she thought she knew about visibility, purpose, and the strange mercy of being truly seen. Before we continue with this story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Never Too Late. Every week we share real stories that remind you, age is just a number. This is a story about invisibility and its opposite, about the difference between being overlooked and being truly lost, and about the stranger who would teach Eleanor that sometimes you have to disappear completely before you can finally be found. Eleanor Hartwell had always been punctual. It was one of those small virtues she'd cultivated carefully, the way other women her age tended prize-winning roses or perfected pie crusts. Every morning at 6:15, her alarm clock, a cream-colored Westclox with luminous hands, would pull her from dreams she never quite remembered. Her house on Magnolia Hill was a modest 2-story craftsman with views of Puget Sound on clear days, which in Seattle meant roughly 60 days a year if you were lucky. The morning routine was invariable: kettle on for tea, 2 slices of wheat toast, raspberry jam from the jar she'd made last summer. The Seattle Times spread across the kitchen table where Richard used to sit with his coffee and racing forms. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the heart attack took him in his sleep, so quietly that she hadn't even woken. She'd rolled over that morning and found him already gone, his face peaceful, one hand still resting on the book he'd been reading, Michener's Chesapeake, bookmarked at page 207. She'd finished it for him. Seemed only right. The house was too big for one person. Everyone said so. Her daughter Claire called from Boston every Sunday at noon Pacific time, 3 o'clock Eastern, right after Claire's tennis lesson, and always found a way to mention retirement communities, condos, the burden of maintaining a house at her age. "It's not about age, Mom," Claire would say, which of course meant it was entirely about age. "It's about practicality." Her son Michael was worse. He didn't call. He sent articles. Printed pieces from magazines about downsizing, about the dangers of isolation, about how widowed seniors were prone to depression and bone fractures and all manner of deterioration, as if she were a house herself, slowly being reclaimed by moss and rot. But Eleanor kept her house. She kept her routines. Tuesday was grocery shopping at the QFC on McGraw Street. Wednesday afternoon was volunteering at the Ballard Library, where she'd worked for 23 years before retiring. Friday evening was the community center potluck, where she brought the same green bean casserole everyone complimented and no one asked for the recipe. She moved through these days like a conductor following a well-practiced score. There was comfort in the predictability, safety in the known. Yet lately, though she couldn't say exactly when it had started, Eleanor had begun to feel a troubling lightness. Not physical exactly, though she had lost weight without trying. More like a sense of coming untethered, of being present, but not quite solid. It started with small things. The checkout girl at the grocery store who looked past her even when Eleanor stood directly at the register. The neighbor who used to wave every morning, now walking his dog without so much as a glance toward her porch. The postal worker who delivered mail to her house for 15 years and last week nearly put Mrs. Henderson's gas bill in her box. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been dead for 2 months. "Excuse me," Eleanor had said. The postal worker startled, actually startled, as if Eleanor had materialized from thin air. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell. Didn't see you there. Didn't see you there." The phrase had been echoing in her mind ever since. Eleanor had been a librarian, which meant she'd spent her career being useful without being noticed. The good librarian is nearly invisible, helping patrons find what they need, maintaining order, preserving silence. She'd been excellent at her job precisely because she knew how to be present without imposing herself. But that was professional invisibility. Chosen invisibility. This was different. She started testing it. Small experiments. She'd stand in the frozen food aisle and see how long it took for someone to say, "Excuse me," when she blocked their path to the ice cream. Minutes would pass. They'd reach around her, through the space beside her, their eyes sliding past as if she were just another freezer door. At the library where she volunteered, she began arriving 10 minutes late, then 20, then half an hour. No one said anything. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the desk, would greet her with the same vague smile she gave everyone, never mentioning the lateness. As if Eleanor had been there all along. Or as if it didn't matter whether she was there at all. The realization came gradually. The way winter darkness comes to Seattle. Not all at once, but in increments so small you don't notice until suddenly it's 4:30 and the world is black. She was disappearing, not dying. She knew what dying looked like. She'd watched Richard's light dim over years of small heart episodes and dietary restrictions and pills organized in a weekly plastic case. This was different. This was erasure. The house on Magnolia Hill had 18 windows. Eleanor knew because she'd counted them one sleepless night in October, walking room to room, turning on every light, trying to prove to herself that she still cast a shadow. She did. The shadows still worked, but they seemed fainter than they should be, as if projected by a failing bulb. She'd always been an organized woman, a woman who made lists. Now she made lists of evidence. Tuesday, October 16th. The girl at the coffee shop didn't charge me, made my latte and set it on the counter and turned away. I stood there waiting to pay for 3 minutes. Finally left money on the counter. She never looked back. Friday, October 19th, Community Center potluck. Set my casserole on the table. Marge Kirkland put her tuna noodle dish directly on top of mine, as if the space were empty. Had to pull mine out from underneath. She never noticed. Monday, October 29th. Sat on the bus for 20 minutes. Young man got on, stood right in front of me holding the overhead rail. When a seat opened across the aisle, he took it. Never saw me sitting there. The lists were meant to be proof, evidence she could examine rationally. But they read like ghost stories. And Eleanor had never believed in ghosts. She'd been raised Lutheran, pragmatic, Midwestern, despite 40 years in Seattle. Her parents had been farmers in Minnesota, people who understood that life was work and work was life, and both ended eventually and there was no use making a fuss. She'd inherited their no-nonsense approach to hardship. When Richard died, she hadn't fallen apart. She'd made the arrangements, accepted the casseroles, thanked people for coming, and gotten on with things. But how did you get on with things when the things no longer included you? The November rain started on a Tuesday. In Seattle, that meant it would likely continue until April, with brief respites for people to pretend they remembered what the sun looked like. Eleanor had long since made peace with the rain. She even liked it. The way it softened edges, muffled sound, gave her permission to stay inside with books and tea and the radio playing softly in the background. But this November, the rain felt personal, accusatory, as if even the weather was trying to wash her away. She stood at her kitchen window on a Thursday morning, watching water stream down the glass, fragmenting her view of the sound into 1,000 separate pieces. Her reflection in the window was faint, too faint. She raised her hand. The reflection raised its hand. But there was a delay, just a fraction of a second, as if the gesture had to travel across some distance to reach her mirror self. Eleanor stepped back from the window. Her heart was beating too fast. She was being ridiculous, paranoid. This was how it started, wasn't it? This was how widows became the crazy cat ladies the neighborhood whispered about. She didn't even have a cat. She needed to get out, needed to be around people. Real people, needed to prove to herself that she was still real too. That's what brought her to Pike Place Market that day. The market was always crowded, always loud, always aggressively alive. If there was anywhere in Seattle you couldn't be invisible, it was Pike Place. She took the 24 bus downtown, paid her fare, the driver took her money without looking at her, but drivers never looked at anyone, that was normal, and found a seat by the window. The city slid past in shades of gray and green. Construction cranes downtown, where they were building something new, always building something new. The Space Needle in the distance, that artifact of optimism from the 62 World's Fair, when people still believed the future would be silver and streamlined. Eleanor's future felt neither silver nor streamlined. It felt uncertain, indistinct. The market was everything she'd hoped for. Chaos and commerce and the smell of fish and coffee and fresh flowers, all competing for dominance. She walked the main arcade slowly, letting the crowd flow around her, grateful for the press of bodies, the proof of physical presence. Except the press of bodies wasn't pressing. People passed too close, closer than the usual polite distance. A teenager with headphones walked directly toward her, and Eleanor stepped aside, except she didn't need to, because the teenager kept coming, kept walking, and passed through the space where Eleanor stood as if it were empty air. Eleanor's breath caught. She turned, watching the teenager continue down the arcade, oblivious, a fluke, just a distracted kid. People didn't look where they were going anymore. But then it happened again. An older man in a mariner's cap, arms full of packages. She was directly in his path. She didn't move. Wanted to see if he'd stop, if he'd say, "Excuse me," if he'd acknowledge her presence in any way. He didn't. He walked through her, not around, not beside, through. Eleanor felt it, felt him pass through her, his substance momentarily occupying the same space as hers, and she felt nothing. No collision, no contact, just a brief, vertiginous sensation of being occupied and then being empty again. She stumbled backward, or tried to. Her feet didn't quite grip the ground the way they should. She reached for a support post, for anything solid, and her hand passed through the wood like a hand through water. That's when the real terror hit. That's when she understood this wasn't gradual, wasn't metaphorical, wasn't something that would resolve itself with therapy or company or a change of routine. She was a ghost. She had become a ghost while still breathing, still thinking, still desperately, terribly alive. Eleanor stood beneath the flower vendor's awning for what might have been minutes or hours. Time had become unreliable. She watched people pass, each one a confirmation of her impossibility. A mother with a toddler in a red raincoat. A couple sharing an umbrella, heads bent together. An old man who looked older than Eleanor felt, shuffling past with his groceries in a wire cart. None of them saw her. None of them could. She tried to speak, to call out, but when she opened her mouth, the sound that emerged was thin, barely a whisper, and it died in the rain before reaching anyone's ears. What was she supposed to do? Go home? How? She'd taken the bus here, but could a ghost ride a bus? Could she sit in a seat that her body no longer quite occupied? Or would she slide through the plastic bench and find herself crouched on the floor, invisible to the driver who'd close the doors and pull away while she was trapped between the physical world and whatever this was? The panic was rising, a tide with no shore. Eleanor felt it in her chest, or in the memory of her chest, tight and sharp and absolutely real despite everything else being impossible. "You're shaking." The voice came from behind her, a woman's voice, calm and low, with the faintest trace of an accent Eleanor couldn't place. Eleanor spun around. Standing there, not 3 feet away, was someone who could see her. The woman was perhaps 70, though age was hard to determine. She wore a long coat the color of charcoal, beaded with rain, and a scarf wrapped around silver hair that fell to her shoulders. Her face was lined deeply, each wrinkle a map of years lived fully. But her eyes were young, bright with something Eleanor couldn't name, recognition, maybe, or understanding. "You can see me," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, but they can't." Eleanor gestured to the crowd moving past them, the endless flow of people going about their ordinary Thursday. "No, they can't." The woman stepped closer, beneath the awning, out of the rain. Up close, Eleanor could see the details. A silver brooch at the woman's throat shaped like a bird in flight. The texture of her coat, wool, real and solid, the way rainwater beaded on the fabric instead of passing through. "How are you here?" Eleanor asked. "How are you solid when I'm—" "You're asking the wrong question." The woman's voice was gentle but firm, the tone of a teacher correcting a bright student who's gone down the wrong path. What's the right question?" Eleanor felt tears threatening, hot and real against her insubstantial cheeks. "The right question is, why did you disappear?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know. I didn't choose this. I don't understand what's happening to me." The woman studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable feeling of being read like a book, every blank page and missing chapter laid bare. "Come with me," the woman said finally. "We can't talk here. Too many people. Too much noise. You need somewhere quiet to remember." "Remember what?" But the woman was already walking away, moving through the market crowd with a sure-footedness that suggested she'd walked these paths 1,000 times. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following. What else could she do? This woman was the only person in days, weeks, who'd acknowledged her existence. She was a lifeline, and Eleanor was drowning. They walked north through the market, past the brass pig statue where tourists posed for photos, past the first Starbucks with its vintage logo and line out the door, past the gum wall that Eleanor had always found unsanitary and fascinating in equal measure. The woman turned down Post Alley, where the rain fell heavier without the market's awnings to block it. Eleanor realized with distant surprise that she couldn't feel the rain. It fell on her, but didn't wet her. She was beyond weather now, beyond physical sensation. The thought should have terrified her. Maybe it had used up all her terror already. They descended a set of stone stairs, worn smooth by a century of footsteps, and entered a doorway Eleanor had never noticed despite walking past this street countless times. The sign above read, "Meridian Books," in faded gold lettering. Inside, the shop was everything a used bookstore should be, dim and cluttered and smelling of old paper and must and coffee from some unseen source. Floor-to-ceiling shelves created narrow aisles that twisted and turned like a literary maze. A cat, orange, substantial, real. Watched them from a perch atop a stack of atlases. The woman led Eleanor to the back of the shop, through a doorway hidden behind a curtain of hanging beads, into a small room that served as office, storage space, and apparently living quarters. A daybed, covered in a faded quilt, sat against one wall. A hot plate and kettle occupied a corner. Books were everywhere, stacked on every surface, some open as if recently consulted. "Sit," the woman said, gesturing to a threadbare armchair. Eleanor sat, or approximated sitting. She could feel the chair beneath her, but also not feel it, as if she were sitting on the idea of a chair rather than the thing itself. The woman put the kettle on, moving with the easy economy of someone who'd performed this ritual 10,000 times. She didn't speak, and Eleanor found herself afraid to break the silence. The cat wandered in and regarded Eleanor with inscrutable yellow eyes, then seemed to shrug and jumped into her lap, or through her lap, landing on the chair cushion and curling up in the space her legs occupied. Finally, with 2 cups of tea steaming on the small table between them, Eleanor noted that hers was there, but she had no idea how to drink it. The woman sat in the opposite chair and fixed Eleanor with that bright, knowing gaze. "My name is Margot," she said. "And before you ask, yes, I've seen this before. What's happening to you? The fading? The disappearing?" "How?" Eleanor's voice was stronger now, desperate for answers. "How is this possible?" "The world," Margot said slowly, "sees what it expects to see. When you stop expecting to be seen, when you stop believing in your own presence, the world obliges. It writes you out of the story. That's not an answer. That's philosophy. Philosophy is just physics. We haven't measured yet." Margot sipped her tea, and Eleanor watched the mundane miracle of a person interacting with physical matter in ways she could no longer manage. "Tell me about your life," Margot said. "The last few years, what changed?" Eleanor wanted to say nothing changed. That was the whole point. But even as the thought formed, she knew it wasn't true. "My husband died 3 years ago. Richard. And I kept living. I kept the house, kept my routines. I volunteer at the library. I go to the potluck suppers. I do everything I'm supposed to do. Why?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. "Why?" Eleanor repeated. "Because that's what you do. You keep going." "No," Margot said softly. "That's what a body does. I asked why you do it. Why you, Eleanor, personally, keep going." Eleanor opened her mouth to answer and found she couldn't. The words wouldn't come because there were no words. She kept going because stopping wasn't an option, because her children expected it, because the alternative was giving up, and she'd been raised not to give up. But she couldn't name a single reason that belonged to her alone. "I don't know," she whispered. "That's where it starts," Margot said. "The fading. When you lose track of your own why. When you become the supporting character in everyone else's story and forget you're the protagonist of your own." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. She was too insubstantial for that kind of breaking. Something else. Some wall she'd built so carefully over so many years that she'd forgotten it was there until it started to crumble. "Richard and I had plans," she heard herself saying. "We were going to travel. See Europe. He'd always wanted to visit the small towns in France where his unit was stationed during the war. We'd saved money. We had the time. But we waited. There was always something. His mother's health, Claire's wedding, Michael's troubles, my father's farm, always something more important than ours someday." The tears were flowing now, hot and bewildering on her ghostly cheeks. "And then he died," she continued. "He died, and all our somedays died with him. And I thought, well, that's it then. That's the end of that story. Time to be useful in whatever ways are left." "Useful to whom?" "To anyone. Everyone. It doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters. Margot leaned forward, her voice intense. Eleanor, listen to me. You have not disappeared because you're old. You have not faded because the world doesn't value you. You have become invisible because you stopped valuing yourself. Because you decided your story was over when Richard's ended. Because you turned yourself into a function instead of a person. I don't know how to be anything else anymore. Then you learn, or you finish disappearing, and this time it'll be permanent. This halfway state you're in, it doesn't last forever. Eventually you have to choose. Become solid again, present again, real again, or let go completely. The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the arms of the chair, or tried to. Her hands passed through the wood. How? She asked desperately. How do I come back? Margot smiled, and it was sad and knowing and somehow hopeful all at once. You already started. You came to the market today. You were looking for life, for connection, even if you didn't know it. You felt yourself fading, and instead of staying home and accepting it, you fought. That's what brought you visible enough for me to see. That tiny spark of resistance, of wanting. But I'm still like this. Eleanor held up her translucent hands. Yes, because wanting isn't enough. You have to remember who you are beyond the roles you've played. Beyond wife, mother, librarian, volunteer. Who is Eleanor? What does she want that has nothing to do with anyone else? Eleanor stared at Margot. The question felt impossible. Larger than the room, larger than the city, larger than the life she'd lived. I don't know, she said, and hearing herself say it, admitting it fully for the first time, was somehow devastating and liberating in equal measure. Then that, Margot said gently, is where we start. The rain continued through the night and into the next day. Eleanor didn't go home. She couldn't have explained why, except that her house on Magnolia Hill felt like someone else's house now, filled with someone else's things, haunted by a woman who dissolved like sugar in water. Instead, she stayed at Meridian Books. Margot made up the daybed with fresh sheets. The living need to sleep, even if they're half ghost, she said, and Eleanor discovered that she could still sleep, could still dream, though her dreams were strange and fluid, full of doorways that led to other doorways and mirrors that showed her faces she didn't recognize. In the morning, if morning was the right word for the gray light that seeped through the small window, Margot brought tea and toast, even though Eleanor still couldn't manage to hold the cup or lift the bread to her mouth. We'll work on the physical later, Margot said. First, we work on the essential. She pulled out a worn notebook, its cover marked with stains and creases, and opened to a blank page. Write, she instructed, handing Eleanor a pen. I can't hold. Try. Eleanor reached for the pen. Her fingers passed through it once, twice. On the third attempt, with Margot watching patiently, something shifted. The pen wobbled, started to fall, then suddenly Eleanor felt it. Felt the weight of it, the smooth plastic barrel, the slight warmth where Margot's hand had held it. Good, Margot murmured. Hold on to that feeling. Now write. Write what? Things you want, not things you should want. Not things that would be responsible or sensible. Things that are true. Eleanor stared at the blank page. The pen trembled in her increasingly solid grip. She felt foolish. She felt exposed. She felt more present than she had in months. Finally, in handwriting that surprised her, had her writing always been so firm, so definite, she wrote, I want to see Paris. She paused, then added, I want to learn to paint. I want to know what it feels like to be selfish. I want to matter to someone the way Richard mattered to me. I want to stop being afraid of taking up space. The list went on. Small wants and large wants. Practical wants and impossible wants. Wants she'd never admitted even to herself. With each line, the pen felt more solid in her hand. With each confession, she felt more solid too. When she finally looked up, Margot was smiling. Look at your hands, she said. Eleanor did. They were still translucent, still not quite fully there, but they were more there than they had been. She could see the lines of her palms now, the veins beneath the skin, the small scar on her thumb where she'd cut herself slicing vegetables years ago. "It's working," she whispered. "Of course it is. You're remembering how to want." It's the most human thing we do. Over the following days, Eleanor lost count of exactly how many time moved differently in the back room of Meridian Books. Margot became her guide through the strange territory of reclaiming existence. They talked, long conversations that ranged from philosophy to grocery lists, from childhood memories to fears about dying, from the nature of consciousness to the best way to make pie crust. Margot had a way of asking questions that seemed simple, but revealed depths Eleanor hadn't known she contained. "What was your favorite subject in school?" "Literature. Poetry, especially. I used to write poems when I was young. Nothing good, just show me." And Eleanor would find herself reciting fragments she hadn't thought of in 40 years. Verses about autumn light and the particular blue of October skies and the ache of wanting something you couldn't name. "Why did you stop?" "Life. Practicality. It wasn't a real skill, wasn't useful. But it made you happy." "Yes. Then it was the most useful thing you could have done." Margot shared her own story in pieces. She'd been an artist once, a sculptor, had a studio in Paris in the 50s, had a whole life of creation and passion and beautiful mistakes. Then she'd gotten married, moved to America to follow her husband's career, set aside her art to raise children and keep house and be the woman her new country expected her to be. "And you disappeared too?" Eleanor asked. "Completely. For 15 years, I was so invisible, I cast no shadow. My own children looked through me. My husband spoke to me like I was furniture. I was less than a ghost. I was an assumption. How did you come back?" "I left. Took nothing but my hands and my eyes and my desperate need to make something beautiful again. Came to Seattle because it was as far from my old life as I could imagine. Started over at 55. That's brave. That's survival." Margot's eyes were fierce. "Brave is optional. Survival is not." Slowly, incrementally, Eleanor solidified. First her hands became fully opaque, then her arms. The sensation returned gradually. Temperature, texture, the weight of her own body. She could hold a teacup again, could turn a page, could feel the cat's warm weight when it curled in her lap. But the process wasn't linear. Some days she'd wake more substantial, able to walk the bookshop aisles and run her fingers along the spines of books. Other days she'd fade again, her body becoming translucent, her voice barely a whisper. Those were the days she'd despair, convinced she was losing ground. "It's not about perfect forward motion," Margot would remind her. "It's about the overall trajectory. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's still progress." On a day when Eleanor was substantial enough to venture outside, though still not fully solid, not quite real enough for the ordinary world to fully register her presence, Margot took her to Cary Park. They stood at the viewpoint, looking out over downtown Seattle with the Space Needle rising like a promise against the gray sky. The sound spread beyond it, pewter under clouds. The Olympics were invisible in the distance, hidden by the same rain that had been falling on and off since Eleanor's disappearance began. "I brought you here for a reason," Margot said. "Look at all those people down there. Millions of them, living their lives, each one certain they're the center of their own universe. And they are. Every single one of them is the protagonist of a story only they can tell." "I used to feel so small," Eleanor said, "like my life didn't matter in the grand scheme." "There is no grand scheme. There's only the small scheme, the personal scheme, the one where what you do with your Tuesday afternoon matters because it's your Tuesday afternoon. You don't have to save the world. You just have to show up for your own life." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not the cracking of before, but something settling into place. A piece of herself clicking home. "I want to go back," she said suddenly. "To the market, to where it happened." "You're not ready." "I think I am." Margot studied her, then nodded. "Then we'll go together." Pike Place Market was crowded when they arrived. The same beautiful chaos Eleanor remembered. But this time, when she walked through the arcade, people noticed her. Not everyone, not consistently, but the flower vendor glanced her way. A fishmonger nodded as she passed. A child pointed at her coat and told his mother he liked that color. Small acknowledgments, tiny confirmations of presence, but each one felt like a victory. They stopped at the flower stall where Eleanor had first realized the truth of her disappearance. The vendor, the same woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, was arranging bouquets of winter chrysanthemums. "Help you with something?" she asked, looking directly at Eleanor. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. The woman could see her. "I'd like flowers," she managed. "For my home." "Something bright. These yellow ones," the vendor said, pulling out a bouquet. "They're called matchstick. They'll bring sunshine to any room, even in November." Eleanor reached for her purse, solid now, real, the leather worn smooth by years of use, and pulled out money. The vendor took it, made change, wrapped the flowers in brown paper with the casual competence of 10,000 transactions. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it more deeply than the woman could possibly know. As they walked away, flowers in hand, Margot touched Eleanor's arm. "You did it." "Did what?" I'm still not completely here." Eleanor held up her free hand. In certain light, she could still see through it, still see the world beyond her skin. "You're here enough," Margot said. "That's what matters. Absolute solidity is overrated anyway. We're all translucent if you look close enough. We're all partly here and partly somewhere else. The trick is to be present enough to matter. To yourself first, to others second." They walked back to Meridian Books in companionable silence. The rain had stopped, and low evening light broke through the clouds, turning the wet streets to gold. Eleanor felt it on her face, the last warmth of the day, felt it truly, completely, the way she'd felt sunlight as a child. That night, as Eleanor prepared to sleep, she'd been staying in the back room for 2 weeks now, Margot insisting she needed time before returning to her old life. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Her reflection looked back, solid, present. A woman of 63 with gray hair and lines around her eyes and a life still being written. "Who are you?" she whispered to her reflection. And for the first time in years, she had an answer that belonged to her alone. "I'm Eleanor, and I'm still here." The following Monday, Eleanor went home. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. The house on Magnolia Hill looked different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The rhododendron still needed pruning. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the left. The view of the Sound was still obscured by November clouds. But when Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped inside, she didn't feel like she was entering a mausoleum of her old life. She felt like she was entering a space that was hers to reshape. The first thing she did was open all the curtains. Light, what little Seattle offered in November, flooded the rooms. She'd been keeping them closed, she realized, as if the house were in permanent mourning, as if she were preserving it exactly as it had been when Richard was alive, a museum to their shared past. But she was still alive, still present, still capable of creating a future. She put the yellow chrysanthemums in a vase on the kitchen table, in the spot where Richard used to sit, not as a memorial, but as a promise. Something bright, something alive, something that said, this space is still being used. That evening, Claire called at her usual time. Eleanor almost let it go to the answering machine. Their conversations had become so predictable, so filled with Claire's gentle concern and Eleanor's reassurances that she was fine, everything was fine, nothing ever changed. But this time, Eleanor answered, "Mom, you sound different, do I?" Lighter, somehow. "Are you okay?" Eleanor considered the question. Was she okay? She'd spent 2 weeks as a semi-corporeal ghost, learning to want things again from a 70-year-old sculptor living in the back of a bookstore. She'd discovered that invisibility was a choice she'd been making unconsciously. She'd nearly erased herself from existence through sheer force of self-negation. "I'm better than okay," Eleanor said. "I'm figuring something out." "That's cryptic, Mom." "I know, but I need to ask you something. That apartment in Boston you're always mentioning, the one in the retirement community near you?" "Yes?" Claire's voice went cautious, hopeful. "Stop mentioning it. I'm not moving. I'm keeping the house. I'm staying in Seattle." She heard Claire's sharp intake of breath, preparing to argue, to explain, to convince. "But," Eleanor continued, "I am coming to visit, not for holidays, not for family obligations, for myself. I want to see Boston in the spring. I've never been, and I'd like you to show me your favorite places, not the tourist spots, your places, where you go for coffee, where you walk when you need to think." The silence on the other end lasted so long, Eleanor thought the connection had dropped. "Mom," Claire finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'd like that very much." "Good. So would I." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, the chrysanthemums glowing yellow in the last of the day's light, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's life reorganized itself around new principles, not schedules and obligations, but desires and curiosities. She enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center. She was terrible at it. Her flowers looked like colorful blobs. Her landscapes were muddy and confused, but she loved it. Loved the feel of brush on paper. Loved the way water and pigment mixed in ways she couldn't quite control. Loved the permission to create something that didn't have to be useful or perfect. She went to the library where she'd volunteered, but this time she didn't shelve books or process returns. She sat in the reading room and read for hours. For the pure pleasure of it, poetry mostly, Mary Oliver and Denise Levertov and Adrienne Rich, women who wrote about being alive in bodies that aged, about the fierce joy of persisting. She started writing again. Nothing she showed anyone, just fragments, observations, attempts to capture in words the sensation of returning to herself. The notebook Margot had given her filled slowly with Eleanor's rediscovered voice. And every Thursday, she went to Meridian Books. Margot would make tea, and they'd sit in the back room, and Eleanor would report on her week like a student updating her professor. But the dynamic had shifted. They were colleagues now, co-conspirators in the project of staying visible. "I'm thinking of traveling," Eleanor said one afternoon in early December. "Richard and I always talked about France. Maybe it's time. Alone? Why not? No reason at all. I think it's an excellent idea." "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted. "I've never traveled alone, never done anything alone, really. What if I fade again? What if I get somewhere far from home and I just dissolve?" Margot reached across the small table and took Eleanor's hand. Both hands were solid, warm, completely present. "You won't," she said, "because you know the secret now. You know what makes you real. It's not other people's validation. It's not being useful or needed or approved of. It's wanting. It's curiosity. It's the audacity to believe your experience matters." "Is that what saved you?" Eleanor asked. "When you disappeared? That and anger?" Margot smiled. "I got so angry at myself for erasing myself, for giving away my time, my art, myself like they were things I didn't need. The anger made me solid, made me fight my way back." "I'm not angry," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "I think I'm just awake, like I've been sleepwalking for years and finally opened my eyes. That's better than anger. Anger burns out. Awareness lasts." As Christmas approached, Eleanor made a decision. She invited Michael to visit. He made excuses. Work was busy. The kids had school activities. It was expensive to fly the whole family west. "Then come alone," Eleanor said. "I'd like to know you as an adult, not just as my son." He came. Arrived on a gray December afternoon, looking harried and slightly defensive, ready for the visit to be a duty he could check off his list. But Eleanor didn't ask about his job, or his children, or his wife. She took him to her watercolor class and laughed at both their terrible paintings. She brought him to Meridian Books and introduced him to Margot, who told stories about Paris in the 50s that made Seattle feel provincial and limitless at the same time. She asked him what he wanted from his life, not what he was supposed to want, and seemed genuinely interested in his stammering, uncertain answer. On his last evening, as they sat in the living room watching rain blur the windows, Michael said, "You're different, Mom." "Am I?" "You seem, I don't know, more here. Does that make sense?" Eleanor smiled. If only he knew how literally true that observation was. "I think I am more here," she said. "For I forgot how to be for a while, but I'm remembering." After Michael left, Eleanor sat alone in her house, not Richard's, not the children's, hers, and took stock. She was 63 years old. She had, statistically, perhaps 20 years left, perhaps more, perhaps less. The quantity didn't matter as much as the quality. She could spend those years fading further, becoming the invisible elderly woman society expected, useful when needed, dismissed otherwise. A supporting character in her children's stories, a volunteer whose name no one remembered, a widow who kept her house too clean and her grief too private. Or she could spend those years becoming more herself, bolder, messier, more curious, more present. She could paint terrible watercolors and travel to foreign cities and write poetry no one else would read and take up space unapologetically. The choice seemed obvious when stated that clearly. On a Thursday in January, as 1980 began to reveal itself, Eleanor sat in Margot's back room and made an announcement. "I'm going to France in April. I've bought the ticket." Margot's face lit up with genuine joy. "Eleanor, that's wonderful. Where will you go?" "Paris first, then some small towns, the places Richard wanted to see. But I'm not going for him. I'm going for me, to see what I see, to experience what I experience. You'll love it. I'm terrified." "Good. Terror means you're alive." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, tea cooling between them. The cat, Eleanor had learned his name was Baudelaire, purred in her lap. "I need to thank you," Eleanor said finally, "for seeing me, for helping me see myself." "I didn't do anything," Margot protested. "You did the work. You made the choice to come back. But you were there when I needed someone to be there. When I was invisible, you saw me. That matters." Margot's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Then I'll tell you something. You saved me too." "How?" "I've been running this bookshop for 20 years. It's been my purpose, my identity, my proof that I exist. But lately, I've been feeling that familiar lightness again, that sense of becoming translucent. I was starting to wonder if I'd become too comfortable, too routine, too invisible again." She reached across and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "And then you appeared, literally fading before my eyes, and helping you remember how to be present, reminded me how to be present. We saved each other." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears this time, grateful tears. "What a strange gift," she said. "And to nearly disappear so completely that you learn what it means to exist." "Not strange," Margot corrected gently. "Necessary. Sometimes we have to lose everything, even ourselves, to understand what we actually need." They talked until evening, planning Eleanor's trip, discussing books she should read, arguing pleasantly about whether Hemingway or Fitzgerald captured Paris better. When Eleanor finally left, stepping out into the January cold, she felt the air on her face, the solidity of the sidewalk beneath her feet, the weight of her own body moving through space. She was completely, undeniably, miraculously present. The months between January and April passed quickly. Eleanor threw herself into preparation with an enthusiasm that surprised her. She bought a new suitcase, bright red, because why not, and walking shoes and a journal with a leather cover. She practiced her rusty high school French with records from the library. She read everything she could find about Provence and Normandy and the small towns of Burgundy. Her children reacted with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Claire asked. "Traveling alone at your age?" "I'm 63, not 93. And yes, I'm sure. But what if something happens?" "Then something happens, and I'll handle it. I've handled plenty before." The conversation marked a shift in their relationship. Claire stopped calling with advice and started calling with genuine questions. What was Eleanor reading? How was the watercolor class? Would she send postcards from France? Michael was quieter about it, but he sent her a guidebook to Paris with a note inside. "Proud of you, Mom. Knock 'em dead." The week before her departure, Eleanor went to Pike Place Market one last time. She walked the arcade slowly, taking in the sensory chaos she'd once feared. The flower vendor recognized her. "Off on an adventure, I hear," the woman said. Eleanor had learned her name was Rita, and they'd struck up a casual friendship over weekly flower purchases. "How did you know?" "You've got that look. That lit-up look people get when they're about to do something that scares and thrills them in equal measure." Eleanor bought a bouquet of tulips, early ones, forced in greenhouses, a preview of spring, and walked to Cary Park. She stood at the viewpoint, looking out over the city that had almost lost her, that she had almost lost herself in. But she was still here, still visible, still capable of leaving and returning and leaving again. The city spread below her, indifferent and beautiful. Millions of people living millions of stories, each one convinced of their own centrality. And they were right. Every single one of them mattered because they existed, because they took up space, because they insisted on their own presence, including her. Eleanor Hartwell left for France on April 15, 1980. She spent 6 weeks traveling alone, seeing things she'd always imagined and things she'd never thought to imagine. She got lost in Paris and found her way again. She ate meals alone in village restaurants and struck up conversations with strangers in her terrible French. She visited the beaches of Normandy, where Richard's unit had landed in 1944, but she went as herself, not as a widow on pilgrimage. She sent postcards. She took photographs. She filled her leather journal with observations and sketches and fragments of poetry. She learned that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. That solitude could be a gift rather than a sentence. And she never faded again. Oh, there were difficult days. Days when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. When she felt the pull toward invisibility, toward becoming useful rather than present. But she recognized the warning signs now, the feeling of lightness, the sense of disconnection. And when she felt them, she'd pull out her journal and write a list of wants. Or she'd call Margot. Or she'd do something purely for herself, something selfish, something unnecessary, something that insisted on her right to exist beyond her utility to others. She lived another 27 years, traveled to 12 countries, learned to paint well enough that her watercolors hung in local coffee shops, published a small collection of poetry that sold 300 copies, mostly to friends. But that 300th person was a stranger who wrote to say the poems had helped her remember how to want things. Eleanor never told her children about the weeks she'd spent as a ghost. Some truths are too strange for sharing. But she told Margot, in conversations that continued every Thursday for 2 decades. And she told herself, in the journal she kept faithfully, honestly, a record of her insistence on existence. When Eleanor died at 90, peacefully, in her sleep, in the house on Magnolia Hill, she left behind a life fully lived. Not a perfect life, not a life that would make history books or inspire movies, but a life that mattered because she had claimed it, because she had refused to disappear. The house was sold, the furniture distributed, the children inherited what they needed and donated what they didn't. But in the back of Eleanor's closet, Claire found something that made her pause. Boxes and boxes of journals, watercolors, photographs from dozens of countries, letters from strangers who'd been touched by her poetry, evidence of a life lived in full color, proof of presence, a record of a woman who'd been invisible and found her way back to herself. "I never knew Mom did all this," Claire said to Michael as they sorted through the boxes. "Neither did I," Michael admitted. "I guess we never really saw her, not as herself, just as Mom." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by evidence of their mother's secret, vibrant, courageously visible life. "I think," Claire said slowly, "that's what she was trying to tell us all along, that we're not just the roles we play, that there's more to us than what others need us to be." The stranger who changed Eleanor's life wasn't a savior or a miracle worker. She was simply someone who saw what everyone else had stopped seeing, who reminded Eleanor that visibility isn't granted, it's claimed. And perhaps that's the real story, not about ghosts or disappearances or impossible second chances, but about the courage it takes to insist on your own existence when the world finds it convenient to forget you're there. At 60, at 70, at any age, it's easy to fade, to become the supporting character, to let your story be absorbed into everyone else's narratives until you can't remember where you end and your utility begins. But it's never too late to become visible again. Never too late to remember that your wants matter. Your story matters. Your presence in the world, messy, imperfect, stubbornly alive, matters. Eleanor learned this the hard way, but she learned it completely. And maybe, wherever she is now, she's still learning, still insisting, still gloriously, undeniably, miraculously present. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, what would you change if you had a second chance? What part of yourself have you let fade that you'd like to reclaim? Don't forget to subscribe to Never Too Late for more stories that remind us the next chapter of your life can be the most powerful one yet, because it's never too late to become visible, never too late to matter, never too late to insist on your own extraordinary, irreplaceable existence.